Welcome everybody. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are, which hemisphere you're inhabiting at the moment. So very glad to see some faces, very glad to be here. I'll introduce myself just quickly. My name is Andrew Salomon. I'm one of the tutors at the Writers College. I live in Cape Town. My day job, I'm an archaeologist, and then I also write novels and short stories. I have, I think, about 4 novels out at the moment and a short story collection and a bunch of publications. The last thing I published was actually in Danish. So it's funny when you look at a journal with a story of yours in and you can't read a single word, but quite fun anyway. And then there's also Nicola, who I'm sure you all know, who is the head honcho at the Writers College, and has organized all of this very nicely for us. And then there's also Alex Smith.
Hi.
And perhaps she can say a few words about herself.
Yeah, so I live in Cape Town as well, and I've been tutoring for the Writers College for more than a decade. The novel writing course, the memoir course, short story course, and advanced short fiction, advanced novel, and advanced memoir and grammar. And I have 5 novels published, 4 with Penguin Random House and 1 with another publisher, and many short stories in different anthologies. And yeah, very much looking forward to chatting to everyone today. Hi.
I've just managed to get my sound on. After all this time, I can now hear you.
Hi, Jenny.
Hello.
We can hear you too, Jenny. That's great. All right. So I suppose we can kick off. I see Amanda. Hello, Amanda. I see you've sent some questions through. I think
Being humble.
All right. So I'd like to kick off with questions by the 2 of you then. Thank you very much for sending them through. Anna, you wanted to know what would be the key points to remember when writing from 2 points of view. Does this ever work? Very good question. So it does work, it can work, but it takes a heck of a lot more planning. And it should probably only be attempted if it's essential to the story and will add to the story. As a gimmick, it can get really irritating for the reader, but it can be done to great effect. David Mitchell writes from multiple first-person point of views to great effect. So if you'd like any examples of this, Ghost Written by David Mitchell, Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, he does this brilliantly. I think the key point to remember if you're writing from multiple points of view is voice of the narrator. They have to be really distinct so your reader doesn't get confused. And then that just makes it more fun and you're happy to go along, but you don't want to be guessing who's actually narrating now. Alex, would you like to add anything with that?
No, I agree with everything you said. I think the key point being, don't do it unless it's really important to the story. There needs to be a good reason to use multiple points of view. Sorry, I always think of them as POVs, but yes, points of view. There should be clarity in your structure. So the way you head up the different voices needs to be clear for the reader. You don't want them to be one paragraph into somebody else's point of view and not quite sure. I recently had to do a critique for a novel that Penguin is wanting to, or is considering publishing, and it was multiple points of view. And the third point of view, I thought it was the one before. I mean, it took me a whole page to actually realize that we'd gone into a new point of view. So I think clarity of structure, and then also the voices need to be distinct. They need to be clearly different people, not just, like Andrew said, some sort of gimmick to make it look more interesting. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. That's That's really helpful. Yeah, I have a draft novel which is 2 characters, but they and the story weaves. But anyway, yeah, it's that distinct voice is, I think, really important. Yeah, thank you.
Also, just demarcating it very clearly. So you have one chapter that's just your one narrator, and the next chapter is just your next narrator. That can work. That's great. And then the reader knows what kind of a journey you're taking them on, and what to expect. So it's all surprising, but it's all also a bit comforting as well to know that, okay, now it's so and so.
Sorry,
okay,
Andrew, can I just jump in there?
Yes.
Sorry, Andrew, I just wanted to clarify. So many novels that do switch, say, every 3 chapters, isn't that usually written in third person? Isn't it quite unusual to swap a narrator if it's first person point of view?
Sorry, I think it can be either. It could be third, it could be first. The one that I was doing was in second person. And yeah, there's one famous, very short American novel that I think has 9 points of view. I just can't think of the name of it off the top of my head. But The Girl on the Train is also a good example of it. And I think that's first person. Yeah, so it could be any.
Okay, thank you. I'll have a read of those writers. Yeah.
Yeah, I think also it works quite well if it's differing points of view, but they're all written from the first person. That's kind of easier to digest as you're reading. I think Cloud, Atlas, and Ghost Written, they've got about 6 different narrators at least, each one narrating in the first person, and it works brilliantly. But it takes him 4 years to write one novel. He says he follows a World Cup cycle, but it can work. It can really work a treat. Another example, there's some of the books of there's an Irish writer called John Connolly, who writes kind of dark crime fiction. I don't know if that's your thing necessarily, but he's very good, and he will switch from third to first person, and he'll have everything in third person, but then when the main character, the protagonist of his novels, is speaking, he just switches to first, but he sticks only to that, and then it's very clear, and it's a bit of a cheat, but it works really well. So, and if you can get away with it in fiction, absolutely.
Great.
Okay.
Jenny?
Can I just say, it doesn't work in short stories. You really have to stick to one point of view all the way through.
I agree.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. We're talking purely novel here.
Oh, okay.
Okay, let's move on to the next question, also from you, Anna. Any words of advice for rewriting drafts? Why does it seem so much more daunting than the first draft? Perhaps Alex would like to take this one away.
Well, yes, I also find the next drafts very daunting, and it helps to actually have other readers. I think for me, that's the most important thing before you begin to rewrite, is to have beta readers, whether you're in a writing circle or you've gotten a writing critique on whether it's a short story or a novel from, for example, the Writers' College, or you're working on it with a tutor through one of the courses, or you have an editor. So either a writing circle and you exchange reading each other's manuscripts, or somebody that you're paying. I think to get an external view is vital, and more than one would actually be first prize, because different people see different things. And once you've got that feedback, I think that's a great place to kick off the rewrite. I think it's quite hard to just write something completely yourself and then sit down again and try and see where you went wrong yourself. You can reading aloud helps. Reading it yourself, obviously, all the way through helps. But for me, I prefer somebody else to read it first and then to start on the rewrite.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I think also the thing to bear in mind with beta readers or anyone who you're giving your work to look at and provide you with advice is it must be somebody who likes the genre that you're writing in as well. It's really, it's quite dangerous to give a horror manuscript to somebody who really loves literary fiction because they won't look at it through the eyes of a fan. And that's what you want. You want somebody to be who's definitely honest, but somebody who really likes the kind of stuff that you've written. I'd also say, why does it seem so much more daunting to write the next draft than the first draft? Is also because we are all scared that it's going to be terrible. And it doesn't matter if you're an aspiring novelist or I know people who have had multiple pieces of their work made into film series, TV series and movies, and who have sold millions of copies, and they are very scared doing the second draft because they're worried that it's going to be bad. And on your second draft, it matters more because you've now put in all this effort with your first draft. You have accepted that the first draft can be quite rough, and it should be, and it's absolutely fine for it to be rough. But now the stakes are higher with the second draft because you now want to start editing and polishing to pull it into the shape of a really good manuscript that hopefully many people will enjoy. So the stakes are higher. So there is, so it does seem more daunting than the first draft, and it probably always will.
Okay.
And that's okay.
Okay. Yeah, because I've been sitting on this first draft for almost 2 years now, just too scared to do anything with it. It just like, I don't know how to make this into something that's good. Yeah, so it's good to hear that that's not an uncommon feeling.
You're not alone at all, no.
Thank you.
I think it's quite difficult to find somebody who's going to read 100,000 words, one of your friends or somebody from your writing circle. It's a big task. It's a big ask.
It
And
is
you
a
really
big
got to trust the fact that you like, that you value their opinion. You can't just show it to them and say, "What do you think?" If they tell you what they think, you've got to do something about it, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, or I mean, you can. There's always bribery, beer and cake, or whatever.
I actually have a friend who did, I'm just remembering now, did offer early in the piece to be my beta reader, and she has a literary degree and is Irish and is possibly the most direct person I've ever met, but she knows literature really well, so I'm scared. I think I should get her to do it.
You should.
She sounds perfect. She sounds wonderful. Definitely. Go with her.
I just have to live with what she says. Yeah.
Yeah, well, whenever in all the editing process, you know, people can make the points they want to make. As the writer, all you need to do is respond in some way in the text. You don't necessarily have to do everything. I mean, they shouldn't really make very hard and fast suggestions. They should just point out areas that are not working for them, and you come up with the solution. And I mean, editing is always hard. It's horrible. I mean, you know, something that you've really liked, somebody puts a little star next to it and says, no, this isn't working for me, or whatever. Yeah, there's always going to be stuff that's kind of difficult to stomach. It just goes with the whole process. But the important thing is to, whatever she raises in her points, is just to, in some way in the text, respond to that in your way.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I will take my courage and step out.
Alex's advice earlier of reading your work out loud is also great, because it really opens up where the rhythm of your piece works and where it can do with a bit more work. That's fantastic, and it's great. It's risk-free. It's just you alone reading your work, and that's sometimes that's exactly what you need. All right, Amanda, let's get to your question. Okay, I'm gonna read it out. You said, I'm not sure how on theme this question is, but I'm curious about writers' perspectives on perspectives. It's completely on theme since we're talking about creative writing a novel, so that's great. You say, for example, how ethical is it to write from the perspective of a character who has a very different identity from you, especially if that identity is marginalized? And you're thinking here of Lloyd Jones and Mr. Pip as an example. Can we be excellent creative writers while writing only from perspectives of characters whose identities align with our own? Great question. Or should I be practicing writing from those different perspectives to improve my writing? To be honest, I don't think I'd ever be comfortable profiting off, if that was to ever happen, a story where I wrote from a marginalized perspective that I don't actively live every day. Okay, cool. So there's a few questions in here, and they're great. And I think each one of them will probably have multi-layered responses, because you can approach this from quite a few different points of view. I think some of the richest fiction has been written by people writing not as themselves. Especially if you look at some really great historical fiction, just the fact that you're writing as somebody or about somebody who lived 400 or 500 years ago, even longer, that's already an enormous jump. Or someone who's a different gender. Ian Banks, a brilliant Scottish writer, some of his very best books, his protagonist is female. So I think, yeah, it can be really difficult. So say, for instance, you're writing and you feel that you're not really getting it, you're not being honest in it, then it's definitely going to come across as contrived. There's no way to get around that. If it feels wrong to you, then that's just a sign that you should change perspective a bit. But also you can write as someone completely different, but it will often just take a heck of a lot of research and a lot of exposure to a different culture, different gender perspectives, all that kind of thing. I guess it all comes back to why you want to do this. If you feel that your protagonist has to be a dwarf in 13th century Spain, then absolutely. I mean, if that's the way that it feels to you, that's the very best way your story will work, then that just means you've got a lot of reading to do about people's experience of dwarfism and living in 13th century Spain and how they spoke and all that kind of thing. And you can definitely make it work. I think especially in contemporary literary criticism, this comes up a lot. And you'll find a lot of the time there are people who see themselves as self-appointed policemen of what someone else is allowed to write or not to write in fiction, or what character a writer should or should not be allowed to take on. And I find this despicable, to be quite honest. In fiction writing, you can write whatever you like. That doesn't mean it'll be good. That doesn't mean that someone else will necessarily even agree with it. But no one can tell you how and what is acceptable to be writing. I think there's lots more to chat about this, but I'd like to take a bit of a break and turn it over to Alex and Jenny.
Yes, I agree. I think also, part of your questions sort of suggested that should you almost make yourself write in these different perspectives as a creative writing exercise. in a way that could be useful. I think it's useful just to look at a story from different points of view. So whether the person is happens to be the same as you or different in age or race or historical position or gender or whatever, that would just come into the fact that it's a different point of view. And I do think it's a good exercise to experiment as a writer with different, with looking at different points of view, how different characters might see the same situation, just as a writing exercise. I think when you choose to write, you write because you're inspired by something. And if somebody's story inspires you and you feel passionate about it and it moves you and you want to create because of that, then you should do that. You shouldn't think to yourself, oh, but I'm not the same as that person. And like Andrew says, so I shouldn't do that. It's not, I don't have a right to write that story. I think if you feel passionate about something, you do have a right, because part of the reason why we write is to grapple with life and with being human. And I mean, that's what we're all human at the end of the day. So you're grappling with that different person's way of being. And then, so as a sort of a student writer, you grapple with whatever you like. When you are somebody who's being published, you choose to grapple with something. If you know that you're going into a contentious area, you must also know that once your work is out there, people are going to question your choice of writing that. So recently, or not that recently, there was a novel called The Tattooist of Auschwitz. And I think the author was from Australia or New Zealand. I'm not sure which one, but so she was the lady who was not Jewish, and it became a huge bestseller. And there were here and there some sort of complaints that why did she have the right to create this story of this man whose name was Gary Sokolov? Why did she have the right to do that story? And actually, he had wanted his story told, and he specifically did not want anyone who was Jewish to write the story, because he wanted someone who had no stories of their own around the Holocaust, no family history connected in any way. He wanted his story to be seen with a completely fresh perspective. And I find that interesting, because I think that it shows a new slant on this whole idea of, you know, who writes what and who's allowed to write what. Sometimes having a removed perspective is actually quite useful. And yeah, so basically I think as a writer, you should write what you want to write, experiment where you want to experiment. There's very little profit involved. So in terms of profiting from somebody marginalized, I think that, well, if you do, good for you. Yeah, you know, I don't believe in people being allowed to be creative in this way and not in that way.
Yeah. And Jenny, is there anything you'd like to?
Oh, I just think you can write what you like. And if you said you can't write about poor, deprived people living in a slum, you'd get no books written, because they wouldn't write books. Somebody needs to tell their story, you know.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so I would read anything. And I also, it annoys me when some people say you can't write this. Those guys are woke, you know, they feel it's wrong, I don't know, socially not to write that. I've heard the term woke so often, and it just annoys me. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's much easier to criticize than to create. But I think we can probably take this a little bit further around your question, Amanda, and then it gets to how to do this well and how to do it convincingly. And so some years ago, I was writing a book set in a circus in the UK, and I'd obviously never been part of the circus. So I had a lot of research to do, and I watched a lot of YouTube, and I read up a lot about circus. And there's a lot of jargon, and there's a lot of culture around things like this that you can use. But I was really struggling with the circus master character, who was a very central character. And it felt like I was just, heaping stereotype onto stereotype as I was trying to get this guy right. And until I watched a documentary about Nick Cave one evening, and I realized this is him. Nick Cave is the circus monster. This is exactly how I would like him to be. So I wrote him as if he's Nick Cave, with the way he speaks, the way he moves, being so tall and gangly, and it all just kind of fell into place. And obviously, I don't know if he really is like Nick Cave, but I wrote him exactly as my perception of Nick Cave was, and I think that rang quite true. So feel free to borrow from any figure in popular culture that resonates with you for a character as well. I find that helps quite nicely. Also, your friends and family you can borrow from, but with greater risk.
Change the names.
Yeah. Anything else? Alex or Ginny, would you like to add anything else to Amanda's question?
No.
Are you? Do you feel it's helped a little bit, Amanda?
Yeah, it was helpful. Thank you. I enjoy hearing everyone's different perspectives on that. It's good to, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
And then we've got some questions from Vanessa, who she's not here, but I'm sure she can watch the recording, and we'll be watching the recording. Her first question is, in respect of tenses, I have had conflicting feedback from different sources. I'm comfortable writing mostly in past tense, and within the scene, I sometimes use present tense to depict the different timelines. Is there one hard and fast rule, or do I stick with what sounds right? So I don't think there's any hard and fast rule when it comes to tenses, but your reader will really appreciate you sticking to one tense. That just makes the writing easier, and that makes the reading easier. Or if you switch from one to the other, again, just make sure it's really well demarcated. It can work well to write a novel in the present tense and have your flashbacks in past tense, or have present tense associated only with one character and have all the rest in past tense. But I really think it's better to, I don't think there's any preference between present and past tense when it comes to novel writing. It seems the fashion these days is very much to write novels in the present tense, much more than before. But both work really well. I would suggest picking one and sticking with it, just from my experience. Alex?
Yeah, I agree. Any past or present, but stick with the tense you select. Past tense is possibly an easier tense to write in. So if it's your first novel or short stories, maybe just work in past tense to start off with, and do stick to the one tense. I think swapping from one tense to the other is going to give you trouble, especially over the length of a novel manuscript. In a short story, perhaps it's not so difficult to manage, but you know, if it's your first novel or first series of short stories, then that sort of thing make easy for yourself rather than give yourself added challenges. It's going to end up with more editing, and yeah, you want to make that easier for yourself, rather, so that you can focus on the creative side of it rather than the grammatical side.
Yes. Jenny, is there anything you'd like to add?
Really? I just write short stories and I stay in the same tense.
There we go. And it works for a reason.
Yeah.
Have you ever changed the tense of a short story after you've read it and felt that it would work better in a different tense?
No, I have to be honest, I haven't.
Okay. No, fair enough. In my experience, it's the same. Only once did I ever look at a short story of mine that I'd written before, and it was in past tense, and it just felt like it would be better in present tense, and I changed, and I thought it was. And I once did that with a novel as well.
No.
So and then you create a huge amount of work for yourself, and It's it still didn't it still wasn't a bestseller, but I am more happy with the with the present tense version. All right, so another question from Vanessa: in respect of thoughts versus dialogue in the written word, is it acceptable to use italics for thoughts of a character for the internal voice instead of the little gosh, what are they called?
Marks.
Yes, the inverted comma. That's what they're called. All right. What do you think, Alex?
Yes, I don't like using inverted commas for thoughts at all. I find it gets messy with the dialogue. I prefer to use italics, or actually it depends on what mode you're writing in. If you're writing in a close third, then you could actually just do away with the italics and the quote marks and maybe just have a little thought tag like she thought, you know, then you don't have to change the font or add any kind of extra punctuation. You can just indicate that that was a thought. And it works quite seamlessly. I think J.M. Coetzee writes a lot in close third, especially the boyhood and the youth, and those, they're good examples to see how he deals with thoughts, and it's very clean. I think it's a stylistic choice. I don't think there's a rule. Like someone like J.M. Coetzee is very fussy about grammar and doesn't like things that stick out unnecessarily. So it's this very clean prose. So yeah.
Yes. Yeah,
Editors have their own way of doing it. You send something in, the editor will totally make it his house style, no matter what you've done for thoughts.
Yeah, that's also true.
Usually it's italics, yeah.
that's right. Yeah, my experience has been the same. It's definitely a stylistic choice, as you've both pointed out. But I think the only hard rule with this is whichever you choose, just be consistent.
Yes, definitely.
That will make your editor and your proofreader and your life a lot easier later on. And okay, next question from Vanessa. In respect of memoir writing, not autobiography, she's quite specific, is it acceptable to change names, scenery, and geography? Now, Alex, you have some memoir writing students. What's your experience here?
I think that changing names is okay. Memoir is also meant to be non-fiction, so it should be true. And I think if you're changing a name to protect someone, or so that they don't, or they may have selected, they may have asked you, because usually if you write something that's true that's going to be published, it's kind of good manners to let anyone who features in the work see what you're going to write about them before it gets published, and they may request that you change their name. So that's absolutely fine. I would have a problem with changing of scenery or geography, because then I think it's not really, it's moving away from being non-fiction. It's becoming fiction, and that's also fine. You can fictionalize, like Shantaram. There's that enormous book, which I think it's Gregory David Roberts. You know, he made it clear that a lot of it was based on his true experiences, but he did also, for people's safety, actually change places, change names, but it wasn't sold as non-fiction. It was sold as fiction. If you look at the back of that book, it says fiction. And I think that's important. I think if you're going to write non-fiction, it has to be true. And the changing of the names is an okay thing because it's protective, but everything else I think should remain as it is.
Okay, that makes sense. I've also come across a few works where the geography hasn't been changed, but the author just hasn't mentioned where it's set implicitly.
Yeah, that's.
And I think that's also okay to kind of get away with, and often you can guess at least which country or possibly which world city it's set in without having to actually name them.
Yes, I think that would be a good idea. If you know, there has to be a reason why you don't want to name a place or a person or whatever. So what Andrew says is, you know, if you're talking about a large city and there's a college in the city, you don't have to spell out the name of the college. You could just mention it's a college in New York. I mean, that could relate to thousands of different institutions. So there is a little bit of a buffer for that institution.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so, and this is a very interesting question. How much dialogue is too much in order to push a storyline forward? I often feel like I'm writing a script instead of a creative writing piece. Perhaps you could, Jenny, what do you think about this? How much dialogue is too much? Is there such a thing?
You can never have too much dialogue. I love dialogue, and it does push the story forward. You know, it makes it alive. If you don't have any, it's really bad. I just like people to speak in stories.
Sure. And you, Alex?
I definitely like people to speak. I find it becomes very static if there isn't any dialogue. But I also, you know, I'm a great lover of place. And so I like to have a bit of description and also some kind of body language, action or stuff that people have. So for me, I mean, I always look for a balance, not necessarily on each page, but throughout the story. I want a little bit of everything. And I think that is, you know, you have that on the page. That's part of your gift, that you can do all that. If you're just writing a radio play, then you can just go with all dialogue. And I mean, if you are very natural with dialogue, then maybe a different medium is something to look at. Like, I mean, radio plays are delightful and they do happen around the world. So perhaps you should experiment. I think the BBC runs an annual radio play competition. And if you are, you know, a natural with dialogue, and many people aren't, many people struggle really to incorporate dialogue, maybe you should look at that medium as well as, you know, short stories and novels on the page. But for the things that are on the page, I think to have a balance for me is first prize.
Yes, yes, I also feel that way. I do feel that there is such a thing as too much dialogue sometimes. If it goes on for page after page after page and it's just dialogue, eventually it becomes like, it feels like watching a tennis match where a single point just doesn't end and just goes, you're just going to and fro, to and fro, to and fro, to and fro. And it does get a bit too much. It almost becomes an information overload and you'd like a break. And as you mentioned, then it's great to employ something like a character taking a sip from a cup or lighting a cigarette. But there's so much more you can do as well. Like you can incorporate sounds in the environment just to break the dialogue up a bit. And I think perhaps the finest example of this in the last couple of decades is David Mitchell's The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet.
Yes, I love
And
it.
that is a masterclass in how to break up your dialogue with other things happening in between, but doing it so subtly that the reader doesn't even really notice that it's happening, but it just immerses you in the scene more and more. So if you haven't had the wonderful pleasure of reading that novel, I envy you. I very rarely reread novels, but that's one I've reread, and anyone will be a better writer after after reading it and seeing how that was done. And he didn't come up with it. He borrowed it from somebody else who borrowed it from somebody else, and now it's your turn. I think Nicola has some more questions over on her side that we can chat about, perhaps.
So Andrew, you might have all covered this already, but one of the questions was newspaper names, magazine names, not necessarily place names. I know you've covered that, but organization names. What legal issues are there around using the real names in fiction?
In fiction, you know, I think that as the writer, you should just write what you want to write. And when it gets published, your publisher will have the editor, and the editor will decide, because different publications will have different sensitivities, and different editors will believe different things. So I think you as the writer, write what you want to write, and when it's going to get published, let them deal with the legal things.
Yeah, I agree. I think you should be a little bit careful though, to if something you're writing is derogatory, and it's fictionalized, then rather attach a fictional newspaper name to it. You know, I think it also allows you more freedom. There are reasons why Superman is set in Metropolis and Batman is set in Gotham City, and not in an actual city, because it then allows that writer to get away with more stuff than they wouldn't have been able to if they had set it in a real world place. So I think just bearing that in mind as well.
Andrew, thank you. I did want to say that maybe there's some other questions in the group. We've actually got quite a few participants that aren't showing up. And they can, if you can hear me, if you can pop a question in the chat function, if you don't want to have your video on. But Gerry and Tracy, if you wanted to ask something, you're most welcome. You can just unmute yourselves as well if you want. Be easy.
Hello, I have a question actually. I'm really bad at having like a routine for writing. So I was just wondering if you have any tips on that, like what are your routines for writing and how do you stick to that? Yeah.
Sure. Hi, Tracy. Nice to see you. Yes, writing routines. Well, I think Alex might feel the same about this. We had writing routines, and then we had children. And I know Stephen King, in his absolutely brilliant work called On Writing, a memoir of the craft, and it's one of the very few books you ever need to read about writing. He talks about showing up every day at the same time, and then your muse will find you. And I think there is definitely merit in that, but it's also not the only way that the muse will find you. The muse will find you probably wherever you are, as long as you show up. So it might be an hour one day and 4 hours another day and no hours the next day, as long as you're just determined to keep it going, and be kind to yourself, knowing that life also gets in the way. But I think a good way to deal with this is also just to don't be afraid to plot and give yourself a fair bit of structure. You can always diverge from it, but having that is really useful. And another tip I picked up years ago, I can't remember where it was, but the advice was to don't end right at the end of the scene, end at the start of the following scene. Don't solve the cliffhanger and then stop at the start of the cliffhanger about to happen. So you actually know where you pick up the next day. So it's not all unknown. At least know where your start off point is. Yeah, that's worked for me.
Ginny, you probably have the best writing routine of all of us.
Why do you say that? I write in the morning.
I think you write more.
Published.
Well, yeah, but I do write in the morning. I get up and by 8 o'clock I'm at the computer, and by lunchtime I stop.
I knew you had the best writing routine of all of us.
Yeah,
I think that if you tend to be a procrastinator, which is I think where I am at the moment as well, it helps to give yourself a schedule. For me, I have to. Otherwise, I've got too many other things that always creep in, and then I don't end up doing anything, even if I think I've got a nice idea. And often I feel something's a nice idea, and then 3 days later, I don't really like it anymore. But if I've made some sort of commitment to it, then I just keep going, because I've said, okay, I'm going to do this, even and make it a reasonable commitment. So if you can manage, if it's an hourly commitment a week, so you're going to write 3 hours a week, and if you get them all done on one day, that's fine. But if you need to take half an hour over a series of days, then that's also fine. Or if you're going to say, okay, I'm going to write on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday between 8 p.m. and 9:30 p.m. or whatever works for you, and you commit to that, give yourself a time period like 3 months, and say, for this next 3 months, I'm committing to that schedule. I think that can be helpful if you tend to be someone who puts off sitting down, because what I find is I have an idea, I really want to do it, but getting to sit down actually proves to be difficult. But once I've forced myself to sit down, then I really start enjoying the writing, and I'm really happy, and I'm enjoying it. It was just that thing of making myself sit down and write the first sentence. Do you make yourself sit down, you commit to that, and make sure that you do it. You sit down, write the first 3 sentences. And then after you've written the first 3 sentences, you'll probably be quite into it for the next hour and a half, and it will all be fine.
Thank you.
Anna?
I'm yeah, speaking as someone who doesn't have anything published at this point, but my first draft happened because I can't remember which course I did. I did one of the master classes with one of the writers there, and he said the same thing, make a commitment. So I committed at first to 500 words a day, and that got really easy. So then I committed, okay, 1,000 words a day, and I ended up doing 2,000 words a day. And even if I came home at midnight, I still had to do my 2,000 words before I could go to bed. And that just I became quite manic about it. It had to be done, that number of words. So for me, it was sitting down for an hour. I couldn't do that. I needed a target number of words, and that worked for me. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent way of doing it. Definitely.
Yeah, indeed.
Oh,
And
thanks.
something I wish I knew when I was writing my first novel was how important it is to keep the momentum going. Well, actually, everybody knows that, but how to keep moving forward the whole time. And there's a dark, dangerous place that you should never go to while you're working on your first draft. And that is the land of revising before you're finished. And it can be so easy to fall into that, because you might feel slightly stuck and not know where to go, but you can think, geez, chapter 2, I've had a great idea of how to make that better. And you go back to chapter 2 and you rewrite it and you make it beautifully polished, which is great, but you haven't actually moved forward in writing your manuscript. And that is really the most important thing on your first draft, at least, is just to get to that end point and to resist that delicious temptation of going back and fixing and tinkering and making chapter 4 beautiful. Make a note of your ideas, but don't go back and fix it. You're just prolonging. And also, if you're stuck, it's often just an indication that you need to go back to your structure and your plotting a bit, or that it's time for a new character or for a subplot, just to get you out of it. I mean, even Neil Gaiman, he's gotten stuck a few times writing novels, and what he does is he goes and he writes a piece of flash fiction just to be writing something else and just to keep that machine oiled. So yeah, that might be what it takes.
Patty, did you have a question?
Yes, I'd like to just ask about writing in a historical context. When you've done all the research that you can possibly do, but you can't find something because it's just totally not there. To what extent can you fictionalize historical people, and particularly famous people? And to what extent can you fictionalize events?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. And I think that different authors of historical fiction will have different answers. I think there are purists who try and stick completely to the facts, but also whoever is putting any kind of dialogue into their historical fiction, unless they've literally taken it from diary inserts, is already making massive fictionalizations, or what people have had for breakfast. I mean, they have absolutely no way. They might pick that up in a diary, what they had for breakfast, but conversations, as soon as there's conversation in historical fiction, there's massive creative freedom. So I personally, I think the further back in history you are setting it, the more leeway you have. I think a very interesting contentious example of that recently has been the Netflix series about the Crown, because that for me really teeters on, you know, I mean, how can they, with these people still alive, claim to create a conversation? I think that's it's very interesting. I mean, I think The Crown is a brilliant series, but it's an interesting question. But I think that, you know, if you're going 100 years back or whatever, I think more or less you can, you know, within reason, create as you like. You can speculate, and especially if you base your speculations on reasonable evidence. I think that, so that if you're questioned, if your novel is published or your short story is published, and somebody says to you, but why did you say, or why did that character do that? And you can say, well, this was like this, and this was like this, and I speculate that these two instances would come together and create this outcome, so that you haven't just made it up off the top of your head, although that is also not completely incorrect. But if you're concerned about accuracy, then if you can lay the evidence out and come to a reasonable possible result, then I think that is fair enough. And anyone who's creating historical fiction is using a lot of creative license as it is.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's important to get the macro stuff right, that anything you can look up in a history book, you'll have those correct. You know, the cannon started firing at 8 o'clock in the morning, and this is well known. Obviously, that kind of thing you'll be sure to include, because that does lend that sense of authenticity to it. But definitely, as Alex said, especially around conversations, there's no way so much of historical fiction can actually be, you know, there's no recording. But you probably have a good idea if a character was known to be jealous or petty or brave and kind, or a combination of it, depending on the situation. And I think it also it's very important to bear in mind the accepted mores of the day. Because what was seen as enlightened in the 14th century is probably quite different to now, even the 17th century. And that will affect what people say and what they do. But yeah, it's daunting. Historical fiction is daunting.
Thank you to all of you for coming, and also to Andrew and Alex for sharing your wisdom and your insights. I know they're hard won over the years. It's been wonderful having you. It's been very interesting. Thank you.
Pleasure.
And so, yeah, wherever you are in the world, I think the night people win in this conversation. So in South Africa, have a lovely day, but to everyone else, a wonderful good night.
Thank you.